rights activists in Washington demanding an end to discrimination against homosexuals and a greater commitment from the government to AIDS research. Good morning. Welcome again to Newswatch. I'm Michael Putney. It's been an historic week for gay men and women in this country. They staged the largest demonstration in Washington since perhaps that great Civil Rights March of 1963. And they also staged the largest single incident of civil disobedience since that time. Some 600 gay activists were arrested on the steps of the Supreme Court this past week. Why this sudden visibility and militancy from the gay community? Clearly, AIDS has a good deal to do with it, and so does a determination not to be seen as second-class citizens in their offices or in their bedrooms. Well, this morning we're going to talk about this new militancy with three outspoken members of the South Florida gay community. Cliff O'Neill is the news editor of the Weekly News, the newspaper of record for the South Florida gay community. He was in Washington this week as a reporter and a supporter. Brenda Stout is the president of Women in Network, and a lesbian organization which encourages gays to do business with other gays, and she is a member of DARE, DAID Advocates for Rights and Equality. Joe McQuay is a freelance journalist and a political activist for gay causes. He is the president of DARE and a former editor of the Weekly News. Good morning. Thanks all for coming here. Let me start by simply throwing a question out, and whoever wants to pounce on it first, please do. Is there a new militancy among gays, and if there is, what caused it? Joe, how about you? I see you ready to answer.
Yeah, unquestionably, there is a new direction. There's a new resolve, and in some cases,
resolve may be a better word than militancy. I
militancy gives the wrong impression sometimes. It has shown up in certain militant aspects. You did see 600 people charging the steps of the Supreme Court to be arrested.
Non-violently, I might add.
Non-violently, of course. Yes. And you also saw anywhere from 250,000 to 750,000 gay people marching in the streets of Washington, protesting non-violently. I'd say if you really had to pin down one reason why there is the new resolve, while there is the new outspokenness, it has to be AIDS. Mm-hmm. Because AIDS not only is a disease that is ravaging the gay male community, but it's mostly a disease that has allowed people the opportunity, almost the community nod. It's okay to discriminate, even more so against gay people.
Yeah. And it's provided a rallying cry, and I really mean that in the sense of the double entendre, a cry from the heart, as I'm sure that you and I mean, who does not know somebody who has died of AIDS?
Oh, certainly. I know far too many. And the thing that I noticed more than anything else is that lesbians have taken AIDS as their rallying cry like they hadn't in 3 or 4 years ago, because they see this as a discrimination vehicle, not only against gay men, but against lesbians and anyone who might be different from what is considered the norm.
Brenda Stout, is that true?
That's very true. Something that we did predict 5 years ago was that with the onset of the AIDS epidemic, that there would be a right-wing reaction to it. We expected it. We expected to see this negative reaction to the gay community in general. We have all suffered it. People don't understand what causes the disease still. There is the lack of education broadly across the country. So people just think of it as a gay disease. Therefore, anyone who is gay is obviously a threat to their family, which is, of course, not true. We have all suffered from discrimination through the centuries, but there is a resurgence of active discrimination against people across the board in this country today. And lesbians have, I think, I disagree with Joe, and I think that we have been there right along in the health centers and the information centers to try to reach out to the gay population to try to help stop the disease right from the beginning.
Cliff O'Neill, you were in Washington this past weekend for the march. Perhaps 500,000 people might be, I think, an accurate estimate of, who knows, maybe a few more, maybe a few less. In any event, it was certainly an achievement to get that many people together for this cause, lesbians and gays. But what did it achieve?
Well, the idea was to let people know that we're out here, that we are their children, their sons, their daughters, their fathers, their mothers. and that, you know, we're not the invisible minority that everyone would have us be, that we're out here and that we count, and we will not be discriminated against, we will not be looked over, and won't let the government make laws or pass laws that will just let us die because certain people within the government would feel we deserve that fate.
Now, one of the brochures which I have from the march last weekend, it stated a number of goals, and the first one was, and I'm reading from your brochure, it said the passage of a congressional lesbian and gay rights bill banning discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Now, realistically, what chance does that kind of bill have of being passed by Congress?
At this point, the chances aren't very good, except after this March on Washington, and after all those people that were at the March on Washington go home and ignite the people that are home with the rallying cry of the March on Washington. And what happened? This is those people will get active, and then will eventually get to such a point that, yes, that demand will be very realistic.
Brenda, in terms of discrimination, let's start with the workplace. Do you think that, generally speaking, from your experience and that of other people in the gay community whom you know so well, I mean, if somebody came right out and said to an employer, all right, I want you to know that I am gay, would they be fired? Would they not be hired? Would they not be promoted?
Certainly in this community they would be fired. They may not be fired specifically with the stated reason that we are firing you because you're gay. They would be put out somehow. That's not a surprise. That's why people are closeted.
Sure, well, but let's narrow this down. I mean, I happen to know that here at Channel 4, I mean, I work with men and women who are gay who really make no secret of it. And as long as they're competent in their work, I am proud to say here, I don't know of anybody who in my 6 years at the station has ever been fired because they were homosexual. Now, I'm not saying that we have particularly enlightened management. I think it's a lot more enlightened, however, than some other places.
I think the entertainment industry as a whole has tended to be more enlightened in terms of allowing people to be a little bit different, regardless of in what manner they're different. It's almost encouraged in the entertainment industry. So in that sense, maybe this station is
I'm not trying to pat us on the back for being more enlightened, but I'm trying to think of just a place. Give me a situation in the workplace.
I'm a CPA. I don't seriously believe that the major company that I have worked for in the past, before I had my own practice, would have allowed me to practice in that company had I been an acknowledged
lesbian. Yes. All right.
Avowed is a bit of a negative
That's the operative
term.
word? Or it's
openly gay would be, or openly lesbian would be the term. Avowed would, I mean, at least to me and many other people, implies that it's somehow something that you don't want to admit or something that you're ashamed of, as opposed to something that you're either open about or you're not.
That's why I use the term acknowledged.
All right, acknowledged better than avowed. Okay. Joe McQuay, tell me, in your experience as a journalist, where is the worst discrimination that you have encountered or seen other people encounter?
It takes forms. I don't think you can really pin it down to any one area, any one profession. Certainly, if you work for a Big 8 accounting firm, you may have difficulties in maintaining your job if you bring your lover to the company picnic.
You don't do that.
No, but it takes place. You know, a person might work for FP&L. I'm not saying they necessarily are. I've heard people who said they've had problems. They may work for even something like Burdines, up in upper level management. By coming out on the job, they could be facing pressures. They may not be fired, you're fired, you're gay, but they may not receive the promotions. They may be given lousy detail or whatever, things to encourage them to quit on their own. And it works all the way down to such places as grocery stores. A couple of years ago, 3 years ago maybe, there was a big stink, an incredibly big stink about some 14-year-old boy who had an earring in his ear.
Right.
Well, what's the problem with the boy having an earring in his ear unless that kid looks like he might be gay? We don't want him to bag groceries. Somehow, you know, that makes him unqualified. And other grocery stores have, I've heard secondhand, people being fired, people being given lousy details, people just...
Most of the people in our business organization are afraid of being known. There are very few of us. Primarily it's people who are self-employed or who work in organizations which are gay organizations that feel comfortable enough to be openly gay. Most people are afraid to. They are afraid if they don't lose their job that they won't have the opportunity to advance.
I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is that it's clear to any thinking person that there is discrimination. There's discrimination in the workplace and in other areas of life as well. Rental housing, or even buying a house, or loan approvals, all kinds of things where I think any reasonable person knows that gay people, lesbians, are discriminated against. I guess the question really becomes, can you legislate against all of that? I mean, I think at some point legislation is not going to be the panacea.
Well, I mean, legislation against racial discrimination and sexual discrimination has been on the books for a certain amount of time now, and we all know that this still happens. There are still ways around it.
Sure.
I mean, I know of just one company who regularly sends out for secretaries from Job Service of Florida, and every time a black one turns up, they turn her back till they find a white one. Even though she's incompetent, they'll keep her, until which point that, you know,
well,
they hire someone else.
some people, to say the obvious, are always going to be put off and afraid of differentness, and somehow homosexuality and all its permutations is a kind of a differentness that leads somebody like, well, here's an article from Friday's Miami Herald where Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina is quoted as saying, in regard to one bill that was before the Senate, or one amendment, he says, this subject, and he's talking generally about homosexuality, is so obscene, so revolting, it is difficult for me to talk about. But then, of course, he managed to talk about it and be quoted by the press. I don't know who Jesse Helms' constituency is, but seriously, there are a number of people who feel exactly that way.
There are a lot of people in this country, and probably elsewhere, who think that gay people should die, for that matter. That was one thing that I found this weekend in Washington, D.C. There were hundreds of thousands of us, and we were free. It was the most wonderful experience of being free. You could walk down the street holding hands with your girlfriend. Such a simple act that heterosexual couples take so for granted, without fear of somebody beating you up. That was a tremendous feeling of freedom, and something I wish could happen normally everywhere.
Yeah. Well, as a kid, for what it's worth, I grew up in Berkeley, California, and I saw, walking down Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, I saw guys holding hands with guys, and I saw women holding hands with their women friends, and I kind of grew up, and it wasn't something off-putting to me. But, you know, I must say that there are really only a few communities in this country where you can see that and not have people offended by it, or at least turn heads. And
there are more
even
now.
in San Francisco,
I hope
there
that
Yeah,
I hope there are
certainly.
more.
And I think that I'm talking to my brother, who is raising two nieces, two of my nieces, and I have convinced him to sort of expose them to the fact that homosexuality exists before they reach puberty, before they reach the age of 18 or 20, when their minds might be set. I think that's very important, because if you expose people to it, I don't mean force them to watch a pornographic movie or anything. I just let them know that it exists. They won't be so afraid of it, and they'll understand it.
Plus, we're normal people. We're just regular people. That was another nice thing for the general public to see on television and their newspapers, that we're just normal people. Look at us. We don't look weird. We don't act weird. We have regular professions, and we eat regular food. And there's nothing to be afraid of. We are your waitress, and we are your banker, and we are your insurance salesman.
And your accountant.
Yes.
Well,
I mean, we still have a lot. I mean, a lot of the dirty work that was, you know, set down 10 years ago in this area by Anita Bryant is still the same stuff that's operating the minds of people in this neighborhood and in people all across the nation. I mean, people are like Oral Roberts and Jimmy Swaggart and et al. Are all on television proselytizing all sorts of terrible myths about us. That, you know, well, okay, homosexuals, this includes lesbians, even though they're the lowest risk group, are going out and maliciously infecting the blood supply and going to run after your children and try to infect them and molest us, so hence we should put them all in concentration camps. That's the sort of attitude that we're battling here.
all right, well, that is the extreme part of it. Now, let me cite an instance that was appears in a new book, and it must be a devastating book. I have not read it. It is called "And the Band Played On: Politics and the AIDS Epidemic." It is written by Randy Schultz, who covered AIDS and the epidemic in the San Francisco gay community. And one of the things that he writes about in this book, the Miami Herald had a front page story the other day, he says that there was one flight attendant from Canada in the late 70s and the early 80s who was infected with AIDS, who refused to stop having promiscuous sex, and who was the typhoid Mary, as it were, of the AIDS epidemic, is responsible for infecting perhaps hundreds of people. Now, there's enough homophobia as it is, but when people read about an incident like that, I think it fuels the fires, and in fact, it's an alarming case. I mean, you read it.
It does, but that's the operative word in what you said is that there was one person who did that. And this person, who apparently went on and had sex in spite of knowing that he was infected with AIDS, did it in the early 80s and the late 70s, when the body of knowledge was not nearly as strong. There was no proof that this was a sexually transmitted disease in 1982, when patient zero was out showing people his lesions at bathhouses. And I think that this book is going to be remembered for the part about patient zero, the part about the typhoid Mary of the AIDS epidemic. But the book is a much bigger volume chronicling how the government did not respond to the AIDS epidemic.
Yes.
And that's just one small part of it.
And
in a way,
not to respond.
the book, in a way, sort of blames this one person.
Well, it singles out the one person, as I understand. Again, I have not read it yet,
But I
Joe.
understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
This may be fuel, very much fuel for
It also, the
homophobic
book, as I
fires.
understand from reading a little synopsis of it, it also accuses the gay community of being much too slow to condemn bathhouses, which were a point where gays did get together for, I mean, some gays, for promiscuous sex, as a place, you know, where the chances of being infected with AIDS were incredibly high. And they're very reluctant to criticize or say they should be closed.
Okay, well, granted that back then, once again, one has to keep in mind and cannot forget the fact that it was not known necessarily to be a sexually transmitted disease. This person denying it and going out and having random sex did not, you know, was denying it, even though there were suspicions to that extent. Bathhouses, though, says yes, San Francisco did battle it, and they eventually are closed. However, that leaves situations open for many gay men who are, say, married or extremely closeted, go out and find sexual contacts in public places, such as parks and restrooms, where they will have more chances of infecting another individual, because in a bathhouse situation, that can be controlled. There can be, in San Francisco and places now where sex is available, there are monitors there to make sure that all sex is risk-reduced. And in any places like that, there is information about risk-reduced sex to make sure that the sexual encounters that happen there, you know, are safe, as opposed to out in a park.
Right, but San Francisco is almost a paragon. It had to be, because it was perhaps more than any other city in the United States impacted by the AIDS epidemic. We're going to take a break, and we'll be back to talk more about gay rights and the AIDS epidemic in just a moment. Welcome back. On this Sunday morning, we are talking with three members of the South Florida gay community about gay rights and gay activism, and in fact also about AIDS. And Brenda Stout, you had said while we broke there for the commercial that in fact if we're going to talk about bathhouses, maybe we should talk about prostitution. So,
just in that trying to control an environment is a good effort. That's what they've done in Nevada with prostitution, trying to legalize and control prostitution to eliminate the disease factor. We could do that everywhere. The likelihood that we're going to legalize prostitution across the country is nil, exactly. So people are going to have indiscriminate sex, whether they be heterosexual, homosexual, or some combination thereof. But we must educate people. That's the only way to do it. And that is, again, part of the positive effects of the march this last weekend, of getting it known out to the public that this is something that everyone must be concerned with.
right. Well, I think that it seems to me anyway, that the time has come that most people in this country long ago stopped, you know, the old canard that it is the gay plague. I think that people now know. You're looking at me skeptically.
I think that's very naive.
Well, I might be naive, but...
They burn houses in Arcadia. It's not naive.
well, I mean, all right, so there are some people who perhaps still think wrong-mindedly and unjustifiably that gay people...
It's a withering minority.
Well, I hope it withers quickly. But to look at something a little bit more positive, in terms of education, Cliff, what is the Weekly News, which has a circulation of 32,000, you say? In terms of reaching your constituents, your readers, What, I mean, obviously you've been writing, I mean, I see the magazine, the newspaper from time to time. You obviously been writing about safe sex and about AIDS networking and everything for years now.
Oh yes, we provide all the latest information on AIDS as we come across it in the body of news. And also Health Crisis Network, Dade County's Information Referral AIDS Service Group, helps, they put advertisements in with safe sex information, also Center One from Broward County, also provide their numbers for further information on the subject, and we're constantly bringing forth anything that we find out. And I mean, safe sex now is just a given within the gay community. If it's not, which unfortunately there are people that still need to be reached, something like an ad in the newspaper isn't going to get it. They're going to have to, I mean, someone's going to have to go out and reach them one by one, which certain organizations are trying to do.
We must also reach out, especially now as the incidence of AIDS has grown in the heterosexual community and is continuing to grow as the incidence of AIDS in the homosexual community is decreasing, to the general public, and let that education be known, which is something that Dade Advocates for Rights and Equality has done. In their one of their lobbying efforts was in terms of billboards. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, Joe McQuay, you are the president of DARE, Dade Advocate for Rights and Equality. What is your group doing?
We're doing a lot of things. Right now, the best way to educate people is to get help from elected officials, certainly. And recently, we helped lobby the city of Miami on behalf of Health Crisis Network and obtain $60,000 worth of billboards, which will be sort of an information education campaign, also refer people to HCN's hotlines, which, by the way, more than half of their calls are coming from the non-gay as opposed to the gay community. In addition,
who are these people calling the hotline? People who have questions
people who
about...
have questions about any and everything. Can I get it from the garbage can? Can I get it from a toilet, from drinking after someone?
And these people are being asked what their sexual preference is? That's how you know that they're...
Well, in the course of a conversation...
heterosexual?
Most people tend to volunteer that information. They're calling what is sometimes considered a gay hotline. They want to be quick to tell them, well, I'm not gay, but, and this is part of the information that they write down. They get it sometimes they don't get the information. But they can tell from the conversations that many, many, many non-gay people are being helped by this kind of information. In addition, I think that it's even more important at this point to educate the non-gay community, the general population, about AIDS. And one of the easiest ways we can do that is to try to convince our congresspeople to mail out the Surgeon General's report. This was done by Jerry Studds in Massachusetts a few months ago, and just within the last few weeks was done by Congressman Lehman here in Florida. One of the things that my group, some of the people in my group were doing in D.C. on Friday was lobbying 3 different congresspeople, trying to convince them to do a mailing of that Surgeon General's report.
Just send it out to the constituents
to the
on their mailing list?
450,000 people in their constituents. Yes, and to let people know. This report is still the single best piece of information about AIDS that I have seen.
All right, well, before we get off this subject particularly, we do have the address of DARE, and we'd like to put it up on the screen right now if we could, and that is the address, and you see it now. And if you want to contact DARE, which is a group that Joe McQuay heads, that is the address. In the few minutes that we have left to us, I want to ask you just one question about the financial cost of AIDS and in treating AIDS patients. A report from the Center for Disease Control says that the average cost per case of the first 10,000 cases was $147,000, and the National Academy of Sciences estimates the direct health care cost in 1991 for AIDS is going to be $8.5 billion. Now, there are some other diseases that cost that much. Head injuries and lung cancer also cost a huge amount of money in that same category. But who's going to pay for these AIDS patients?
Well, I think it's folly to think that the AIDS patients themselves are going to be able to pay for it.
Of course they can't. Yeah.
And so far, it has been a combination of relatives, friends, and in some cases the federal government through Medicare. So far, there has been precious little help in the state of Florida from either the state, the city, or any of the county governments. The state is providing money to upgrade Jackson Memorial Hospital to provide a model treatment center.
Right. There was $5 million, if I may interrupt, in the last budget to go to Dr. Fischel for an AIDS treatment center at Jackson.
Yes, we do have a good facility, but unfortunately that's only one community. There are other areas. There's Broward County, which is...
And the AIDS hospice in Broward, I know just this week, ran into some problems, and 7 men who live in that AIDS hospice are going to have to move out.
That should give you an indication of what kind of cooperation some of the local governments are providing. That's one of the main reasons why, after 10 years of silence, some of us in Dade County finally decided to get a gay political group going. This button, which I'm wearing, probably can't be seen.
I wanted to ask you about that.
Is it says silence equals death. This is something that came out of New York. Basically, to me, it means as long silence only helps the oppressor. And some of the people who are zero funding AIDS programs and some of the people who are being homophobic and blaming AIDS on gay people are the oppressors in this thing. If we stay silent, we're going to die.
Same as happened in World War II. We can't let that happen to us. We won't let it happen to us.
And I know one of the points you want to make, obviously, is that it isn't just gay rights, it is human rights.
That's correct. That's very correct. Something that we have seen over the decades, that I have seen over the decades, I've been active politically for many years, was having grown up in Georgia, I marched for the desegregation effort, and then later on against the war in Vietnam. It works.
Activism pays off.
It does. To get masses of people together and say, this must stop. We must do something to make the world better. And we were joined. We were joined by many people outside the gay community, and I think we will continue to grow in the future.
Well, on that point, a happier note, and I hope this wasn't too much of a downer, but there is some tragedy to talk about as well as some uplifting things. So thank you for coming, Brenda Stout, Cliff O'Neill, and Joe McQuay. I appreciate it, and thank you for joining us too. I invite you to join me here next week on Newswatch for another Newsmaker. Until then, I'm Michael Putney. Have a great week.